Germany, May 1945. A 12-year-old boy stands before two American soldiers. He's filthy. His uniform, several sizes too large, hangs off his thin frame. His face is streaked with dirt and dried tears. He hasn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. One of the American soldiers holds out two items. In his left hand, a cone of vanilla ice cream already starting to melt in the spring sun. In his right hand, a bottle of Coca-Cola, condensation beading on the glass. The soldier smiles, speaks in broken German. Choose one. Whichever you want. The boy stares at both. His hand reaches forward, hesitates, reaches again, stops. Ice cream. Something he remembers from before the war, from childhood, from a Germany that no longer exists. Or Coca-Cola. Something he's never tasted. Something American. Something foreign. Something representing everything he's been taught to hate. For most children, this would be a simple choice. A treat. A moment of joy. But this wasn't most children. And this wasn't a simple choice. This is the story of Germany's child soldiers. Of boys as young as 10 sent to fight in the final desperate months of World War II. Of an entire generation that had their childhood stolen, their minds poisoned, their innocence weaponized. And of one moment, one choice, that would come to symbolize the impossible position these children found themselves in. Caught between a past that had been a lie and a future they couldn't imagine. Over the next half hour, you'll discover how Nazi Germany turned children into soldiers, how boys barely old enough to shave were given rifles and sent to face tanks, how American soldiers reacted when they captured prisoners who should have been in school, not in trenches, and what happened to an entire generation of German youth who had to rebuild their identities from nothing. But first we need to go back to before the war, back to when this 12-year-old boy was just a child. Back to understand how Germany created an army of children willing to die for a regime that was already dead. His name was Hans, at least that's what we'll call him, because his story is the story of hundreds of thousands of German boys. Boys who were children when the war started, boys who were soldiers when it ended, boys who had to figure out who they were when it was over. Let me show you how this happened. Germany 1933. Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor. Hans is born that same year. He will never know a Germany without Nazis. He will never know a childhood without Hitler. Fury. From the moment Hans could walk, the Nazi Party was shaping him. German children didn't just grow up under Nazi rule. They were systematically indoctrinated from infancy. Every aspect of childhood was militarized, politicized, weaponized. At age 6, Hans would have joined the Pimpfei, the cubs of the Hitler Youth. Not optional, mandatory. By 1939, membership in Hitler Youth was legally required for all German children. What did 6-year-olds learn in Hitler Youth? They learned that Germans were the master race, that they were destined to rule Europe, that Jews, Slavs, Roma and others were subhuman. They learned that war was glorious, that dying for the Führer was the highest honor, that individual life meant nothing compared to the collective German Volk. They learned through songs, through games, through stories, through constant repetition. They sang songs about marching to war. They played games that simulated battles. They heard stories of German military heroes. They were taught that their parents' generation had been weak, that they had lost World War I, because they weren't committed enough, that this generation would be different. This generation would be pure, strong, victorious. Hans learned to read using Nazi-approved textbook. Math problems. Asked students to calculate the trajectory of artillery shells, how much it cost to care for disabled people, therefore why they should be eliminated, how many bombs it would take to destroy enemy cities. Biology class taught racial science, measuring skulls, categorizing people by supposed racial characteristics. Jews were shown as vermin, as parasites, as the enemy within that must be destroyed. History class taught that Germany had been betrayed, that the Treaty of Versailles was a humiliation, that Germany had a right, a duty, to reclaim its greatness, that war was not just justified, but necessary. Geography class taught Lebensraum, living space, the idea that Germans needed to expand eastward, that Slavic peoples were inferior and existed only to serve Germans, that conquering Eastern Europe was Germany's destiny. Every subject, every lesson, every moment of schooling was filtered through Nazi ideology. At age 10, Hans would have moved up to the Jungvolk, the Young People's Division. Here the training intensified. Weekend camps became mandatory. Boys learned map reading, compass navigation, how to move through forests without being seen, how to identify enemy aircraft, how to throw grenades. They ran obstacle courses, crawled under barbed wire, learned hand-to-hand combat. They were taught to ignore pain, to suppress fear, to follow orders without question. They went on multi-day hiking expeditions carrying full military packs. They learned to sleep outdoors in winter, to march for hours without complaint, to function on minimal food and water. And they learned to shoot. By age 12, most Hitler Youth members had extensive weapons training. They learned to field strip and clean rifles, to shoot accurately at 100 meters, to handle grenades. Some units trained with Panzerfaust, anti-tank weapon. This wasn't preparation for maybe becoming soldiers someday. This was preparation for war that was already happening. Hans turned 10 in 1943. By then the war had been raging for 4 years. Germany was losing. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. The myth of German invincibility was crumbling. But Hans didn't know that. He knew only what he was told. And what he was told was that Germany was winning, that temporary setbacks were just that, temporary, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that final victory was certain. He believed it. Why wouldn't he? It was all he'd ever known. Every adult he trusted told him this. Every song he sang reinforced it. Every lesson at school confirmed it. Every Hitler Youth meeting repeated it. Hans believed in the Führer, believed in Germany, believed that he was part of something glorious and eternal. He had never tasted Coca-Cola, had never seen an American movie, had never heard jazz music. Everything American was forbidden, decadent, degenerate, enemy. But he had tasted ice cream, before the war, before rationing. Ice cream had been a treat, a reward, something his mother would buy on special occasions, something that represented normal childhood, normal Germany, the Germany before the bombs started falling. By 1944, ice cream was a memory. Most food was rationed. Luxury items had disappeared years ago. German children grew up hungry, malnourished. Many had never eaten chocolate, never had fresh fruit, never had a full meal, but they were told this was noble sacrifice, that their hunger was helping the soldiers at the front, that deprivation was character building, that comfort was weakness. Hans turned 11 in 1944. That was the year everything changed. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces landed in Normandy. The Western Front, which had been quiet since 1940, suddenly exploded. Germany now faced a two-front war. It couldn't win. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly, pushing through Poland, heading toward Germany itself. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces were fighting their way across France. In the south, Italy had already fallen. Allied forces were pushing north. In the air, American bombers flew during the day, British bombers flew at night. German cities burned continuously. The Nazi leadership knew they were losing, but they would never admit it. Instead, they doubled down. Total war. Every German must contribute. Every resource must be mobilized, including children. In September 1944, Hitler created the Volkssturm, the People's Army, a militia composed of men too old or too young for regular military service. Men from 16 to 60 were called up, but that wasn't enough. As casualties mounted, as the regular army was decimated, the age limits expanded, first to 15, then to 14, then younger. By early 1945, boys as young as 10 were being drafted. given uniforms that didn't fit, given weapons they could barely lift, given a few hours of training, and sent to the front. Hans was 12 when he was called up. January 1945. The war was clearly lost. Though no one would say it, Soviet forces were in Poland, less than 100 miles from Berlin. Western allies were crossing into Germany. The end was near, but still the call went out. Every male must fight. Age didn't matter. Experience didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was bodies, warm bodies to throw at the advancing enemies, to slow them down, to buy time for what? No one knew. There was no plan, no strategy, just desperate, suicidal defense. Hans reported to a collection point. He was given a uniform, grey-green Wehrmacht tunic and pants, several sizes too large. They'd run out of children's sizes. He rolled up the sleeves and cuffs, cinched the belt as tight as it would go. It still hung loosely. He was given boots, also too large. He stuffed newspaper in the toes. He was given a Carabiner 98K rifle, a weapon designed for adult soldiers. For Hans, it was almost as tall as he was. The recoil when fired would knock him backward. He was given 3 days of training, 3 days to learn what regular soldiers spent months learning: how to load the rifle, how to aim, how to fire, how to maintain it, how to dig a foxhole, how to recognize enemy vehicles, how to throw a grenade. 3 days. Then he was shipped to the front. The train journey took 2 days. The train kept stopping, hiding in tunnels when Allied aircraft appeared, taking detours around bombed-out tracks, moving only at night. Hans sat in a cattle car with 40 other boys and old men, all conscripted into the Volkssturm, all untrained, all terrified, though none would admit it. The older boys tried to act tough, made jokes, bragged about how many enemies they'd kill, but their eyes betrayed them. They were scared. The younger boys, the ones Hans's age and younger, were quieter. Some cried, some sat silently, holding their 2 large rifles, looking lost. An old man, maybe 60, sat next to Hans. He'd fought in World War I, knew what war really was, knew this was suicide. "You shouldn't be here," the old man whispered. "None of you should be here. Your children." Hans bristled. "I'm a soldier of the Reich. I'm ready to fight." The old man looked at him sadly. Didn't argue. What was the point? The boy believed what he'd been taught. There was no reasoning with a decade of indoctrination. They arrived at the front in late January 1945. Eastern Front, Poland, facing the Soviet advance. The scene was chaos. Refugees streaming west, fleeing the advancing Red Army. Wounded soldiers stumbling back from the front. Artillery booming in the distance. The horizon lit up with explosions. Hans and his unit were assigned to a defensive position, a hastily dug trench on the outskirts of a town. Their orders were simple: hold the position. Don't retreat. Fight to the last man. No one mentioned that man included 12-year-old boys. The next 3 months were hell. Hans learned what war really was. Not glory, not honor, not the heroic songs and stories from Hitler Youth. Just mud and cold and fear and death. He learned what it felt like to be constantly terrified, to jump at every sound, to not sleep for days, because the artillery never stopped, to be so exhausted that you'd fall asleep standing up, even with explosions all around. He learned what hunger really was, not the rationing back home, real starvation, days without food, eating snow to fill your stomach, chewing on leather straps, fighting over a single potato. He learned what cold was. Winter on the Eastern Front. Temperatures far below zero. Frostbite. Fingers turning black. Toes going numb. Sleeping in frozen mud. Waking up to find the soldier next to you had frozen to death in the night. He learned what death looked like. Up close. Person. Constant. The boy next to him in the trench took a sniper bullet through the head. 1 second he was talking. The next second his head exploded. Brain matter splattered across Hans's face. He vomited, then wiped his face and kept fighting. An old man from his unit stepped on a mine. His leg was blown off at the knee. He screamed for 20 minutes before bleeding out. No medics, no morphine, just screaming until he went silent. A 14-year-old tried to surrender to Soviet troops. They shot him anyway, left his body in no man's land as a warning. Hans fired his rifle at shapes in the distance. Didn't know if he hit anyone. Didn't want to know. Just loaded and fired. Loaded and fired. Following orders. Doing his duty. He was wounded twice. First time, shrapnel from an artillery shell. Cut his arm open. He wrapped it with a dirty cloth and kept fighting. No medical attention available. Second time, a ricocheting bullet grazed his leg. Hurt like hell, but didn't hit bone. He limped for a week. Kept fighting. By March 1945, his unit had been reduced from 60 men to the rest dead, wounded, captured, or deserted. By April, they were down to 7, including Hans. By May, the end was near. The Soviet army was in Berlin. Hitler was dead, though Hans didn't know that yet. The Nazi regime was collapsing. Orders stopped coming. Command structure broke down. It was every unit for itself. Hans's commander, a 55-year-old veteran, made a decision. The war is over, he said. Anyone who wants to surrender, go, I won't stop you. Half the remaining men went east towards Soviet lines, hoping to surrender. They were never seen again. The Soviets were not kind to German soldiers, especially not SS or Volkssturm. Hans and 2 others went west, toward American lines. They'd heard Americans treated prisoners better, fed them, didn't execute them. It was their only hope. They walked for 3 days, avoiding Soviet patrols, avoiding bands of refugees, avoiding SS units that were still fighting, still executing deserters. They walked through devastation, towns that no longer existed, villages burned to the ground, roads cratered by bombs, bodies everywhere, soldiers, civilians, animals, all dead, all rotting. They walked through the end of the world. On the 3rd day they encountered American forces. It was a patrol, 4 American soldiers in a jeep. They spotted Hans and his 2 companions, walking down a road. The jeep stopped. The Americans raised their rifle. Hans and his companions raised their hands, dropped their weapons, the universal gesture of surrender. One of the Americans approached cautiously. He was young, maybe 20. He looked at these 3 figures in German uniforms. Then he really looked. Jesus Christ, the American said. They're kids. Hans was 12. One of his companions was 13. The other was 14. All filthy, all skeletal, all looking far older than their years. The American lowered his rifle. How old are you? He asked in broken German. 12, Hans said. The American looked sick. 12. They're sending 12-year-olds. What the hell is wrong with these people? He called over his companions. They looked equally disturbed. These were American soldiers who'd been fighting across Europe for months. They'd seen terrible things, but something about these child soldiers shook them. Search them, the sergeant said, then get them to the POW collection point. They were searched, thoroughly. They had nothing, no weapons except the rifles they'd dropped, no food, no identification beyond their Volkssturm armbands, no personal items, nothing. When did you last eat? The sergeant asked. Hans had to think. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. Time had blurred. The sergeant opened a ration pack, gave each of them a chocolate bar. Real chocolate. Hans hadn't seen chocolate in years. He ate it so fast he nearly choked. His stomach, unused to real food, cramped painfully. He didn't care. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. They were loaded into the jeep, driven to a collection point. There were hundreds of German prisoners. Most were regular Wehrmacht, some SS, a few Volkssturm, almost all adults. Hans and his 2 companions were the youngest. Other prisoners stared at them. Even hardened German soldiers looked disturbed at seeing children here. They were processed, names recorded, ages verified. They were separated from the adult prisoners and taken to a different section. There were about 20 other child prisoners, ages ranging from 11 to 15. all Volkssturm or Hitler youth, all looking lost and terrified. American soldiers didn't know what to do with them. These weren't hardened Nazis, these were kids who'd been brainwashed. Sure, kids who'd been armed and sent to fight, but still kids. One American soldier, a corporal named Miller, took it upon himself to look after them. He'd been a teacher before the war. He looked at these German children and saw his students back home. Miller spoke some German. He talked to the boys, asked about their families, where they were from, whether they knew if their parents were alive. Most didn't know. The war had scattered families. Some boys' parents were dead, some were missing, some were in other parts of Germany. Possibly alive, possibly not. Miller did what he could. He got them food, real food. Not much, but more than they'd had in months. He got them blankets, got them access to water to wash, though there was no soap. He tried to explain to them that the war was over, that they were safe now, that they wouldn't be executed, that they'd be sent to POW camps, that they'd be treated humanely according to the Geneva Convention. Many boys didn't believe him. They'd been taught that Americans were monsters, that they tortured prisoners, that surrendering meant death. They expected to be shot at any moment, but days passed. They weren't shot. They were fed. Guards, though armed, weren't cruel. Slowly the boys began to relax slightly, to believe they might survive. Hans had been in American custody for 5 days when it happened, the moment that would define the rest of his life. It was a warm May afternoon. The war in Europe was officially over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had fallen. But for these child prisoners, the future was uncertain. What would happen to them? Where would they go? Who would claim them? Miller walked up to the group of boys. He was carrying something. 2 items. "Gather round," he said in German. "I have something for you." The boys clustered around, curious. Miller held up his left hand, a cone of vanilla ice cream. It was melting slightly in the warm sun. Where he got it? Hans didn't know. American supply lines were incredible. Even in the ruins of Germany, they had ice cream. Miller held up his right hand, a bottle of Coca-Cola, condensation beaded on the dark glass, the distinctive curved bottle, the red and white label. "Ice cream," Miller said, holding up the left hand, "or Coca-Cola," holding up the right. "You can choose, one or the other, whichever you want." He looked directly at Hans. "You first, which do you want?" Hans stared at both. Ice cream. He remembered ice cream. Summers before the war, his mother buying him a cone as a special treat, the cold sweetness on his tongue, the simple joy of childhood. Ice cream was Germany, was home, was the past, was everything he'd lost. Coca-Cola, he'd never tasted it. He'd seen advertisements before the war, before American products were banned. He'd been taught it was degenerate, American poison, enemy culture. Coca-Cola was America, was foreign, was the future, was everything he'd been taught to hate. This should have been a simple choice. He was a child. Children like sweets. Other option was a treat. But Hans hesitated. If he chose ice cream, what did that mean? Was he clinging to the past, to Germany, to the ideology he'd been raised with? Was he rejecting America, rejecting the future? If he chose Coca-Cola, was he betraying Germany, accepting American culture, admitting that everything he'd been taught was wrong? Was he turning his back on his entire childhood? He stood there, hand outstretched, frozen between the two. Miller watched him, didn't rush him, just waited patiently. Hans's hand moved toward the ice cream, stopped, moved toward the Coca-Cola, stopped. The other boys watched silently. They understood somehow that this was more than just a choice of treats. This was symbolic. This was choosing an identity. Hans's mind raced. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd been taught, the Führer, the Reich, German supremacy, all of it had crumbled. The regime had fallen. Hitler was dead. Germany had lost. But did that mean everything was a lie? Was there nothing worth keeping from his past? Could he just abandon his entire identity? Or should he embrace this new world, this America that had won, accept that the old Germany was gone, that he needed to become someone new? He was 12 years old, and he was being asked to make a choice that adults would struggle with. His hand moved forward, slowly, hesitantly. He chose. He took the Coca-Cola. Miller smiled, handed it to him, showed him how to open it. The bottle cap came off with a hiss. Hans lifted it to his lips, took a sip. It was strange, sweet, fizzy, unlike anything he'd ever tasted. Not bad, just different. He took another sip, bigger this time. The carbonation made his nose tingle. The sweetness was almost overwhelming after years of bland rations. He stood there drinking this American beverage, this symbol of everything he'd been taught to despise, and he found it wasn't terrible. It was just soda, just a drink. Maybe America wasn't so bad after all. The other boys made their choices. Most chose ice cream, something familiar, something that reminded them of home, of childhood. A few chose Coca-Cola, curious about this forbidden American product, willing to try something new. But Hans always remembered that he'd chosen Coca-Cola, and for the rest of his life, he would wonder why. Was it rebellion, a rejection of everything Nazi Germany had represented? Was it curiosity, a desire to experience something new, something forbidden? Was it pragmatism, an acceptance that the old world was gone, and he needed to adapt to the new one? Or was it simpler than that? Was it just a 12-year-old boy who wanted to taste something he'd never had before? Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it was none of them. Maybe it was just a moment, a choice. Neither right nor wrong, just a choice. But in the aftermath of World War II, in the ruins of Nazi Germany, every choice had weight. Every decision was symbolic. Every action was a statement about who you were and who you wanted to be. Hans had chosen Coca-Cola. He had chosen America, whether he understood it at the time or not. But his story doesn't end there, because the choice of a beverage was easy compared to what came next. Figuring out how to live in a world where everything you'd been taught was a lie, where your childhood had been stolen, where your identity was built on poison. Hans was one of hundreds of thousands of German child soldiers, boys as young as 10, who'd been armed and sent to fight in the final months of the war. The exact numbers are unclear. Records were destroyed. Many deaths went unrecorded, but estimates suggest 20,000 to 60,000 children served in the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth Combat Units in 1944, 1945. Thousands died, shot by enemy fire, killed by artillery, caught in the collapse of their own military. Some as young as 11 were found dead in German uniforms, rifles still clutched in their small hands. Thousands more were captured by Americans, by British, by Soviets, by French. All the Allied powers encountered German child soldiers in the final months. All struggled with what to do with them. The Geneva Convention had rules about prisoners of war, but it didn't really address children. Were these combatants or victims? Should they be imprisoned or protected? The answer varied by captor. Soviet forces, brutalized by years of German invasion and atrocities, often showed no mercy. Many German child soldiers captured by Soviets were shot. Others were sent to labor camps in Siberia. Few returned. Western allies generally treated child prisoners more humanely. They were separated from adult POWs, held in special camps, given food and basic care, but they were still prisoners. American forces, like the unit that captured Hans, struggled the most with the moral implications. These were children who'd been brainwashed, forced to fight. How were they responsible? In the months after Germany's surrender, these child prisoners faced an uncertain fate. Some were held for months, some for over a year. All the while they tried to understand what had happened, to process the end of their world. They learned the truth, the full truth about Nazi Germany, about the Holocaust, about the concentration camps, about the millions murdered, about the atrocities committed in Germany's name. For many, it was devastating. They believed in the cause, believed in the Führer, believed they were fighting for something noble. Learning it was all a lie broke them. Some refused to believe it. insisted it was Allied propaganda, clung to their Nazi beliefs, even in the face of evidence. These boys were the hardest cases. Most remained unrepentant for years, some for their entire lives. Others accepted the truth, but were destroyed by guilt. They'd fought for this, killed for this. Even as children, they felt complicit. Many struggled with this guilt for decades, and some, like Hans, fell somewhere in between. They accepted that Nazi Germany was evil. They rejected their indoctrination, but they also recognized that they'd been children, victims of a system that had used them. They tried to forgive themselves while never forgetting. In late 1945 and early 1946, most child prisoners were released. They were returned to Germany, to cities that no longer existed, to families that might be dead, to a country that was ruins. Germany in 1946 was apocalyptic. Major cities were 70–80% destroyed. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, all reduced to rubble. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The economy had collapsed. Disease was rampant. And in this wasteland, former child soldiers tried to rebuild their lives. Hans returned to his hometown in late 1946. He was 13 now. He'd been away for nearly 2 years. 2 years that felt like a lifetime. His home was gone, destroyed in a bombing raid. But his mother was alive. She'd survived in a shelter. When Hans appeared at the refugee center asking if anyone knew about his family, someone recognized his name, took him to his mother. The reunion was emotional, painful, joyful. His mother barely recognized him. When he'd left, he'd been a child, 12 years old, small, innocent in a way. The boy who came back was different, taller, thinner, with eyes that had seen too much. He moved like a soldier, flinched at loud sounds, stared at nothing for long periods. "What did they do to you?" his mother asked, holding him. "I don't know," Hans said, and he meant it. He didn't know how to explain what he'd experienced, didn't have words for it. His mother tried to help him return to normal life. But what was normal? Germany was occupied, split into 4 zones controlled by America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The Nazi Party was banned. Former members were being prosecuted. The entire country was undergoing denazification. For Hans and millions like him, denazification was psychological warfare. They had to unlearn everything, had to accept that their entire childhood education was propaganda, had to rebuild their understanding of the world from scratch. Schools reopened, but the curriculum was completely different. Teachers who taught Nazi ideology were fired. Textbooks were burned. New books arrived from the Allies, teaching democracy, human rights, the truth about the war. Hans sat in class with other children his age, but they weren't really children anymore. They'd seen things, done things. They sat silently while younger children asked innocent questions about the war. The teacher showed films, documentaries about the concentration camps, about Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, the mass graves, the gas chambers, the survivors, skeletal and haunted. Hans watched, felt sick, felt the guilt rising. He'd fought for this, he'd believed in this. "You were a child," his mother told him. "You didn't know," but he had known. At some level, people knew. There were whispers, rumors. The deportations of Jews weren't secret. The violence wasn't hidden. People knew something terrible was happening. They just chose not to look too closely. Hans had been a child, but he'd been a true believer. He'd absorbed the ideology completely. He'd hated the people he was taught to hate. He'd believed in German superiority. He'd been willing to kill for it. How responsible was he? At 12, at 10, at 8, when he first learned to hate in school, there were no easy answers. Germany struggled with these questions for decades, still struggles with them today. How do you assign responsibility when an entire generation of children was systematically brainwashed? The Nuremberg trials prosecuted high-ranking Nazis. But what about the millions of regular Germans? What about the soldiers? What about the children who were soldiers? Most were never prosecuted. There were too many. The Allied powers needed Germany to function, needed Germans to rebuild their country. Mass prosecution was impossible, so most former Nazis, including former child soldiers, went on with their lives. They got jobs, raised families, tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Hans lived with what he'd experienced every day, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the guilt, what we now call PTSD, though it wasn't diagnosed as such then. He struggled in school, couldn't concentrate. His mind would wander to the trenches, to the boy whose head exploded, to the old man who bled out screaming. He struggled to make friends. Other children seemed so innocent, so naive. They'd been children during the war. He'd been a soldier. The gap was unbridgeable. He drank, starting in his teens. It helped quiet the memories, dulled the nightmares. German beer became his escape. Ironically, since he'd once chosen Coca-Cola over German ice cream. He never married, never had children. The idea of bringing new life into a world that had shown him such horror seemed impossible. He worked various jobs, construction, mostly, helping rebuild the Germany he'd helped destroy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He never talked about the war. When people asked if he'd fought, he said yes, but volunteered nothing more. The questions stopped coming. Most Germans didn't want to talk about it anyway. The past was painful. Better to focus on rebuilding, on the future. But the past haunted him. In 1989, Hans was 56 years old. The Berlin Wall fell. Germany would reunify. The Cold War was ending. A new era was beginning. Hans watched the celebrations on television. Young people dancing on the wall. East and West Germans embracing. The joy, the hope for the future. He felt nothing. He'd lived through the end of one German state in 1945. Now he was watching the end of another. States rise and fall. Ideologies come and go. What remained? What lasted? He thought about that day in 1945. The choice between ice cream and Coca-Cola. He'd chosen Coca-Cola, chosen America, chosen the future. Had it been the right choice? Germany, or at least West Germany, had become a democracy, prosperous, peaceful. It had confronted its past, more or less, built memorials, taught the truth in schools, tried to ensure never again. America had helped make that possible. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, decades of protection and support. So yes, choosing America, choosing the future, had been the right choice. For Germany, for the world, but for Hans personally, he wasn't sure. His life hadn't been happy. The war had broken something in him that never healed. The guilt never fully went away. The nightmares never stopped. Thousands of former German child soldiers lived similar lives, broken by what they'd experienced, haunted by what they'd done, struggling to reconcile the innocent children they'd been with the soldiers they'd become. Many committed suicide. The rate of suicide among former child soldiers was significantly higher than the general population. The trauma was too much, the guilt unbearable. Many turned to substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, anything to numb the pain, to silence the memories. Many simply shut down emotionally, went through life on autopilot, never really living, just existing. A few found ways to heal. Therapy, support groups, art, writing, activism. They channeled their pain into something constructive, became advocates for peace, for children's rights, for ensuring no generation ever experiences what they did. But healing was rare. Most just endured. Hans died in 2003 at age 70. He died alone. No wife, no children, few friends. He'd lived a quiet life, worked hard, paid his taxes, didn't cause trouble. At his funeral, there were maybe a dozen people, cow workers, neighbors. No family. He was the last of his line. The pastor, who barely knew him, gave a generic eulogy, talked about his work ethic, his reliability, his quiet nature. No one mentioned the war. No one mentioned that Hans had been a child soldier, that he'd fought in the final desperate months of World War II, that he'd seen and done things no child should ever experience. No one mentioned the choice between ice cream and Coca-Cola. After the funeral, Hans's few possessions were sorted. There wasn't much: some clothes, some tools, a small savings account, and in a box in the back of his closet, a collection of items he'd kept his entire life: a faded photograph of his mother, a medal he'd been awarded in Hitler Youth. He'd never thrown it away, though he'd never displayed it either. A piece of shrapnel that had wounded him. And at the bottom of the box, a Coca-Cola bottle cap. Old, rusty. From 1945 he'd kept it. All these years. A reminder of that moment, that choice. That day when he'd chosen the future over the past. When he'd chosen something new over something familiar. When he'd taken a small step toward accepting that his world had ended, and a new one was beginning. That bottle cap was, in its way, the most important artifact of Hans's life, because it represented the moment when a 12-year-old boy, traumatized and broken and lost, made a choice. Not a big choice. Not a world-changing choice. Just a small one. Ice cream or Coca-Cola. He chose Coca-Cola, and in doing so he chose to live in the world as it was, not as he'd been taught it should be. Hans's story is tragic. A childhood stolen, a life scarred, a man who never found peace. But his story is also just one of hundreds of thousands, because Nazi Germany didn't just send children to fight in the final months of World War II. It spent 12 years molding an entire generation into soldiers, into believers, into weapons. The Hitler Youth membership in 1945 was over 8 million. That's 8 million children and teenagers who'd been indoctrinated from early childhood, who'd been taught to hate, to obey, to fight. Most never saw combat, but all were affected. All had to unlearn the poison. All had to rebuild their identities. All had to figure out who they were without the Nazi ideology that had defined them. Some succeeded. They became teachers, artists, business people. They raised families. They built the new democratic Germany. They confronted the past and tried to ensure it never happened again. Others failed. They clung to Nazi beliefs, became neo-Nazis, passed their poison to another generation, ensured that the ideology, though defeated, survived in the shadows, and many fell in between. They rejected Nazism, but never fully recovered from it. They lived quiet, damaged lives, trying to forget, never quite succeeding. This is the legacy of Nazi Germany's child soldiers. Not just the boys who fought, but an entire generation that was weaponized, used, broken. The youngest are in their 80s and 90s now. Soon they'll all be gone. The last living witnesses to what happens when a society turns its children into soldiers. When education becomes indoctrination. When childhood becomes training for war. Their stories need to be told, not to excuse what Nazi Germany did, not to diminish the crimes of the regime, but to understand the full cost of totalitarianism, the way it poisons not just the present, but the future. The way it destroys not just bodies, but minds and souls. And to remember that when we see children with guns today, whether in Hitler's Germany or modern conflicts in Africa, the Middle East, or elsewhere, we're looking at victims, traumatized, manipulated, exploited victims who will carry scars for the rest of their lives. Hans chose Coca-Cola. He chose to step into an uncertain future, rather than cling to a poisoned past. It was a small act of courage. It didn't heal him, didn't fix what was broken, didn't erase what he'd experienced, but it was a choice, a moment of agency in a life that had been controlled by forces beyond his understanding. And sometimes that's all we can do: make small choices, take small steps, try to move forward even when we don't know where we're going. In 1945, a 12-year-old German boy stood before two American soldiers. They offered him ice cream or Coca-Cola. He chose Coca-Cola. It seemed like such a simple choice. But nothing about that moment was simple. It was the end of one world and the beginning of another. It was a child, trying to figure out who he was when everything he'd believed was a lie. It was a small act of rebellion, or acceptance, or just curiosity. It was a choice that would define a life, and in its own way, it defined a generation. Germany, May 1945. The war is over, the Reich has fallen, and a boy stands with a bottle of Coca-Cola in his hand, tasting something new for the first time, wondering what comes next. That's where the story begins, not ends. Begins. Because the aftermath of war lasts longer than the war itself. The trauma endures, the questions remain, the ghosts never leave. Hans lived another 58 years. He never found peace, never fully recovered, never forgot. But he survived, and in surviving, he bore witness to the cost of war, to the evil of using children as weapons, to the difficulty of rebuilding an identity when the foundation was poison. His story matters, not because it's unique, it isn't, but because it's representative of millions of children who were used and broken, of a generation that paid for the crimes of their elders, of the long shadow that totalitarianism casts over human lives. When we think about World War II, we remember the soldiers who fought, the civilians who died, the Holocaust victims, the heroes and villains, but we often forget the children, the ones caught in between, too young to be responsible, but old enough to be used, too innocent to understand, but forced to participate. They deserve to be remembered too. So remember Hans. Remember the choice between ice cream and Coca-Cola. Remember that it wasn't really about beverages. It was about identity, about the past and the future, about choosing who you want to be when everything you've been is revealed as a lie. And remember that somewhere in the world right now there's a child soldier facing similar choices, trying to figure out who they are, trying to survive, trying to imagine a future beyond war. They deserve better than Hans got. They deserve to be rescued before they're traumatized, protected before they're weaponized, educated, not indoctrinated. They deserve a childhood, a real one, not the twisted mockery that Nazi Germany gave its youth. That's the lesson of Hans's story. That's what we owe to his memory and the memories of hundreds of thousands like him. Never again, not to any child, anywhere. That's what Hans chose when he took that bottle of Coca-Cola, a future where children aren't soldiers, where choices are about treats, not identity, where growing up doesn't mean learning to kill. He never lived to see that future fully realized, but he chose to believe in it, and that choice, small as it was, mattered. Ice cream or Coca-Cola, the choice that defined a generation, the choice that reminds us what we're fighting for, and what we must never allow to happen again. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for bearing witness to Hans's story and the stories of all the children who were used as weapons of war. Their voices deserve to be heard, their pain deserves to be acknowledged, their hope for a better future deserves to be honored. Remember them, and fight to ensure no other generation of children has to make choices like the one Hans faced. That's how we honor their memory, that's how we ensure their suffering wasn't meaningless. Never forget. Never again.